Now, I'm going to call on our last speaker, John Waters, who is interested in the pharmaceutical industry and the psychiatric industry, as he describes them, and various other matters too. So off you go, John.
Thank you, Katrina. It's very nice to be back in Port Lais, which is the way that the woman on the Google GPS pronounces it, and because it is, it will be the way it will be pronounced in 20 years by everybody. Myrne, when she invited me, she gave me actually rashly probably a choice between all three, and I rather even more rashly said to her I would let her decide, and she ended up choosing the one that I was least kind of sure as to where it fitted into the discussion of 1916 and 2016 and all that. So, but you know, I started thinking, I had a certain idea, and as Katrina said, I had certain obsessions that I wanted to ventilate. But coming down last night and listening to Diarmaid's wonderful speech, which is so clear and factual and inhabited by a clear subjectivity, which I think is the most important thing. And I hope he's left, that he doesn't hear me praising him, because that can be death to the career of many people in this country. I began to kind of, expand my thinking a little bit, because obviously, you have a theme. Things are so fragmented now in the way we are presented with things, that we kind of focus on things and we're not clear of the bigger picture. But it became clear to me overnight that this really is something, this interest groups thing is quite central to where we are. And many of the questions, particularly from the audience today, struck me as touching on this importance. Porry Pearce in Ghosts talked about interests. He talked about first of all the idea that the untruth that nationhood is a corporeal thing, defined by statute and guaranteed by mutual interests. And he said that where freedom is considered, interests should not be spoken of. And contrary to what was asserted later on, he was very concrete in the way he talked about freedom and nationhood and so on. He talked about spiritual necessities, hail nationality, the idea of people, the rights of man in Ireland, the right to live a good life. That really was what freedom was. And when I look back at my life, I think I remember a time when that was kind of becoming true, when it was kind of, for all that we kind of disparage the past, there was a time in Ireland when, looking back, and it isn't, I don't think, nostalgic, perhaps a little, but nevertheless, I think you can define a characteristic of Ireland or different characteristics which fit into that concept that Pearce had, which was an Ireland free, and as he intimated, in some way not encumbered too much by interests. In other words, a democracy, a real republic. And as Katrina says, I have mentioned, I have referred to in my email to Katrina to certain interest groups, the chemical industry, the pharmaceutical industry, also social networking, IT, because we sit in a country now which is really in effect governed by transnational corporations of particular kinds, chemical, IT, technological, and social network industries, Twitter, Facebook, and then of course Google and so on. And these people, if we can call them people, and of course under American law they are people, because there was a judgment of the Supreme Court in America some years ago which actually said that a corporation had the same rights as a human being, so they really dictate to us how we live, quite stealthily and without us knowing. For example, immediately they tell us, about our taxation system, what it should be, that we have to pay half of our incomes over to the state so that they don't have to pay anything. This is one of the things they tell us. They teach us, we had some talk earlier about the education system and what's been happening to it. This is at the behest, essentially, of these corporations who demand a certain kind of mentality if they're to find the workers to operate their businesses. A man asked a question there, which is kind of overlooked in the last discussion. I thought it was a really interesting question. He talked about the treadmill, that we have created in Ireland of the treadmill. And I think that's really something that we should think about. This opposition, I would say, this kind of republic that I think about, and I want to describe it in a moment, that I remember from my childhood. It was a kind of a burgeoning republic, a little seed of a republic, which you could see, which had been cast on the ground and which was beginning to flower. That has been kind of swept aside. And we have a different Ireland, and an Ireland which, for all we kind of tend to kind of praise ourselves and clap ourselves in the back, and then tell ourselves we're being too hard on ourselves and praise ourselves again. Really, we need to be quite, I think, cautious about looking at what we call freedom now. The republic that I remember was very much a concrete place. It was a place that I lived. It was the street I lived. It was the countryside that I drove around in with my father. You know, and I would say it was defined by a quality of the concrete. That it was about intrinsic value, intrinsic wealth, as opposed to extrinsic wealth, which is money. The street where I lived had many. My father used to, when he would do his mail runs, and we would meet many people, farmers mainly, on the way around and talk with them. And of course, they had a particular philosophical outlook. In the town, it was somewhat different. He used to meet tradesmen, craftsmen, Pa Burke the tailor, Ted Finch the mechanic, Eddie Rock the shoemaker, Beatty Haw the master butcher, Michael Dyer the baker. Michael Hawthorne, the stonemason, and so on. And he would engage in deep discussions with these people about the state of the country and about the work they were doing. And in my mind, as a child, these two things were connected in some way in the minds of these men, that their autonomy, their ability to intervene in the world creatively and philosophically was related to what Pearse talked about, to the kind of condition of a Hail nationality as residing in freedom, the freedom to be a man in Ireland, to be a human being in Ireland. And that was very, very visible. Now, Dermot said last night, one of the things that struck me very forcibly was his invocation of Jean Kerrigan's non-voluntary amnesia in relation to the Civil War, that he didn't hear about this until he was 19. I heard about the Civil War when I was 7 from my mother, because she was very aware that my father, who had been 18 at the time of the Civil War, had been really formed. I still don't know what happened, but I do know many times in my life when I would be going hammer and tongs at my father about one thing or another, she would call me aside afterwards and say something along the lines of, you know, you should really be more understanding of your father because he saw things that you'll never see. So, you know, we had a memory. There was a memory. I think actually it's Dublin that doesn't have a memory in Ireland. The rest of the country has a much stronger, and as you go westwards, the memory becomes stronger. And I, coming from the West, I would regard myself as having a pretty good memory for things I never experienced. Which you can do, because you get them in a kind of a process of osmosis, and then only afterwards do you realise, that's what that is. That's why my uncle roared like that in the middle of the night. So now we are in this different culture in which, as the gentleman up there talked about, the treadmill, where each of us is, you know, what happened was that these skills, which was on the street or in the farmyards, or what, my grandmother, for example, who had a totally autonomous farm where she produced virtually all her own needs, except for tea and sugar, and then she exchanged her eggs for the tea and sugar on Saturday night with a travelling shop that came from the no money. So all of these values were implicit in the landscape of the time. And united with the idea of nationhood, and united with the idea of freedom. So there was no conflict at all, and it was an ease. And, you know, and nor was there a conflict with the idea of Catholicism. I mean, people think now that, you know, somehow these people were going on beating their breasts and terrified of a whack of the crow's ear or something. They were totally irreverent about all those things, totally kind of, you know, anti-clerical. You know, they had their own devices. I remember my father never listened to sermons or anything like that. He said the rosary throughout Mass and fell asleep in the process thereof. And by the end of the Mass, he used to choose a space in front of the confessional. And by the end of the Mass, he would be laying prone on the floor like a man about to be consecrated as a bishop, and have to be woken up from his slumber. So there's a total distortion, again from the amnesia of Dublin, or perhaps an inexperience of Dublin, of any kind of reality to do with the reality of the fabric of Ireland. So now we have these chemical industry, and I just want to talk, and I will later, maybe in response to questions, but there are certain things we need to look at here. That education, we're told that we're the most educated, the young generations are the most educated in Irish history, but they're educated in a way that really would not have been regarded as education at all 30 years ago, 40 years ago. They're educated in a very microscopic way to address certain tasks. Everything else is really not, they don't have an integrated, holistic view of their human interaction with reality. It's a really serious problem now that we have an education system which is actually being more and more turned around to the needs of people who want to destroy the humanity and of human beings and reduce them essentially to cogs in machines and to work for Twitter or Google, give them elevated titles. And of course, what we're finding now in these organizations is that whereas the salaries were quite good at one time, they're now subject to yellow packing, which is bringing the whole thing. So effectively, we're going back to the era of we have people with PhDs essentially putting nuts on Volvos. And look at what the chemical industry did to the landscape in Ireland. I mean, we talk now about water charges. 25 years ago, when I joined the Irish Times, one of the first things I did was I wrote a series of every day for a week about the state of Irish water. And it was very interesting that one of the concepts that came out at me then was going around to the lakes of Ireland, Lake Corrib and Loch Mask and these places, was this term enrichment, pollution. What a metaphor that turned out to be, the relationship between enrichment and pollution. And that was the chemical industry. And of course, there was no possibility of questioning this really fundamentally any more than, you know, as Helen has been talking about, the idea of, you know, all of the industries really that we have now, on which our life depends, it seems, which we're told, and who dictate the terms of our lives, are industries who are intent upon, it seems to me, exploiting our humanity, of redefining our humanity. Take the pharmaceutical industry and the psychiatric. You can get into enormous trouble as a human being who is subject to things like sadness or joy or fear or despondency or despair from time to time by questioning the concept of depression. I've heard many instances. I remember a wonderful interview which Michael Harding, the writer, a colleague of mine, a good friend of mine, gave on RTE some years ago about the period of darkness that he went through, and he expressed it really graphically. And he was asked by the interview, but did you take medication? And he said, no, I'm a writer. I like to be present for what happens to me, which isn't a bad idea for a writer. I wish more of them would do it. But he at the end of the interview, he was called back, as it were, and like one of those Soviet dissidents who were brought to confess to their sins, had to say, of course, he wasn't in any sense questioning the validity of medication as an instrument of treating depression, and of course, you know, it's very good for many people. Now, I have a book here, which one of two books I want to mention, Depression Delusion by Dr. Terry Lynch. I would advise everybody to read it. It's a wonderful book about precisely the delusion of what is called depression and the delusion of the idea of the biochemical connection between human sentiment, emotion, mood, and any kind of seating in the physical reality, that there is no proof of it, and that many of these technologies, of these medicines, are actually bogus. And much research has shown, for example, that there is virtually no difference between the effect of these medications and what's the word for this? Placebo, yes, a placebo, virtually negligible. So at the same time, I mean, I know from my own personal experience, in a throwaway comment I gave in an interview about something entirely different a couple of years ago, to this effect, this became the headline in the article, and I was bombarded with telephone calls from journalists wanting to put me on trial for having unapproved ideas and opinions about things. I declined those invitations. Now, here we have, again, an element of our in a sense, our sustenance as a people, which is deeply suspect, which is morally, I think, dodgy, and which is damaging our people. And the ideology is being protected, so you can't actually get at it. You can't actually question it. Terry Lynch who's a doctor, GP, worked for a GP for 25 years. He's a psychologist, psychotherapist. I think he told me that he has had one interview on the George Hook show and a one-line mention in the Irish Examiner. Nobody else is interested in doing this. So again, we talk about freedom, the freedom to say, people talking about salary, we can say, no, we can't. And maybe later I'll talk about the experience we had earlier this year in the referendum, which is probably the lowest point of our democracy. Nothing to do with the substantive issue, but for the manner in which we were invited to discuss it, which was pretty much, don't discuss it. Now, so this is the real, I think, crux of our problem, that there has been a radical shift in our culture. A friend of mine, Billy Brown, a wonderful musician, used to talk about living off the splash, because he was also a painter and a writer and different things. And he used to say he got bits and pieces from everywhere. And he used to say there are animals who live in the sea and there are animals who live in the land, and there are animals who live along the line of the sea, on the shore. And they survive off the splash. And in fact, that's where we are now. We live off the splash. We don't actually have an indigenous way of sustaining ourselves. We depend entirely on the drops and the scraps that come into us from the global economy. And I think there was, again, this kind of ideology of globalism. There was an attempt by somebody today to conflate universalism with globalism, which are two different things. You know, Ibsen is not the Google of literature, as it were. So, you know, there's a lot of dishonesty in this. And of course, it's more and more because precisely of these technologies. And I want to maybe touch on this later, because I know I'm running up on the clock here.
I'm giving you that glare right now.
Oh, is that the glare?
A bit over. That is the
okay.
glare. You
But
recognise it now?
yes, this whole thing about the interworking now, because it's very interesting that these are all here. The social networking sites are all here. The Twitters. You can't get Twitter on the phone. You can't find them.
Of course not.
They're untraceable. You know, and yet if you write anything slightly dodgy about them, they'll ring up the editor on the landline.
So they have phones, but we can't get to them.
So there are many things, I think, that we need to think about. This is more or less, I think, where this focus is, that our country is being run by these people. We don't know it. It's invisible. Things that happen, the things that go bang in the night are going bang in the night because of the activities of these people, not because they're being asked for by any democratic force in this nation. The difference, I would say, between the pressure of interest groups, it is these men that I talked about, my father, they were Democrats, they were Republicans. They had opinions, they fought, they argued, and then they voted. They loved their country. They carried the Constitution around their pocket. Nobody now knows what's in the Constitution. They just want to change it into something else. So this is what I would say.
Okay. Thanks, John.